Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I'm Andrew Sumner, and today we're privileged to be joined by author Alex Thomson, the author of the wonderful new novel Spidertouch, also the author of Death of a Clone, one of our favourites from a few years ago. Teacher slash author Alex Thomson. How are you, Alex?
I'm fantastic, thank you. So glad to be on the YouTube. Yeah.
Oh yeah, thanks so much for joining us. Now, we're big fans of your new novel, Spidertouch, which you can find at the links attached to this conversation. What can you tell me about it, mate?
So Spidertouch, well, it's a fantasy. It's a siege fantasy set in a city under siege, and the fantastical element of Spidertouch is that the ruling alien race who control the city, they rather than speaking with their mouths, they speak with touch. So it's a touch language that they communicate digitally by communicating with basically fingers on each other's arms.
And where did he get the inspiration for that from?
I think I've always, I'm a language teacher, and I've always been interested by the different types of languages that you can find. Not just the basic speaking languages, but some of the more unusual ones, and all the kind of ingenious ways that humans have come up with to communicate with each other. So things like Braille, sign language, and so on, or even animals, with the way they communicate with scent and stuff. So I found myself thinking, well, how is it we've never created a language with touch, which is this kind of underused sense that doesn't really get exploited as much as it should really. So yeah, I thought I'd love to write a book about a touch language. And from there, I also had always wanted to write a book about a translator, because I think translators are these really interesting figures who they're kind of the ultimate unreliable narrator. You never can quite trust whether what they say is correct, because they're the only people who know both sides of what they're translating. So those two strands kind of came together, and I ended up with this kind of city under siege fantasy with an interpreter as the hero.
And your hero, who's one of the enslaved race, is that correct? And
that's right. Yeah.
So it survives through means of his translative abilities.
Yeah, and so he's able to kind of be one of the kind of city elite, because he's able to translate. He's able to work for these the alien race, but also translate for the kind of city the citizens of the city with this skill. And yeah, that was something that always interested me as well. The idea of if you were in an oppressive regime, would you be a collaborator or would you be a revolutionary? Obviously, as a French teacher, I've done a lot on the resistance in World War II in France, and it's something that I think people always like to think they'd be one of the resistance, but actually I think history tells us a lot of us would end up being collaborators. And that was a theme I really wanted to explore. How you'd react. Would you revolt or would you collaborate?
I think that's a very interesting fundamental question, and I would imagine pretty much like investigating one's fight or flight instinct, you never really know the answer to that question in reality until you're actually in that situation, right?
Absolutely, and I think the weird thing about oppressive regimes is that there's always been this kind of steady supply of martyrs and people who are willing to give up their lives for the revolution. But I wanted to kind of push it a bit further to really make sure that everyone would be forced into collaboration. And so the idea I came up with was this alien race basically holding the people's children hostage. So they send all the teenagers to work in mines, and essentially you're a hostage to their good behavior. So if you don't pay your taxes, or if you any kind of insurrection, then it's not you that's punished, but it's your children.
Yeah.
And so although I think a lot of us think that we would revolt if it came down to your children being held hostage, I think the truth is not many of us would actually be willing to risk our children's lives, right?
No, I think that's a very well observed point, and as that point, I think fiction and drama, particularly film drama, movies and television, they perpetuate the stereotype that revolutionaries, rebels, people who don't collaborate are these kind of heroic figures, whereas history tells us that actually real revolutionaries come from a much more mixed set of people, and it's often people you wouldn't expect are the people who actually do fight back. And it's a very human instinct to try and find some way to get on with someone, even if it's your tormentor or oppressor.
right, yeah, so the Stockholm syndrome, and yeah, I think that everyone's capable of making that argument for compromise, and the argument for being pragmatic and saying, well, let's just get on, let's just get along and try and make the best of a bad situation. Yeah, I agree. I think people love the romantic ideal of the revolutionary, but whether or not it would actually happen is a different matter.
I think that's a very well made point. Now, you've had such a fascinating journey to becoming an author, because you worked in the book business, you became a teacher, you teach Spanish and French, if I recall correctly, and then you wrote Death of a Clone. I'm thinking it was 2-3 years ago, maybe now.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. How did you end up making that journey? What led you to the point you're at now?
I mean, I think, as I'm sure you know, the kind of the state of languages in not just Britain but Anglophone countries is pretty shocking. It's because of the development of English is this kind of almost not quite global language, but the kind of lingua franca of a lot of societies. It's allowed us to get very lazy, and so yes, so languages in this country is just in a dire state, and that was one of the reasons I made that move into teaching. What was it, six years ago? Just because we're crying out for language teachers. The number of people who are studying languages at A level and degree level is just plummeting. So it was something that I really felt I wanted to make that change, because I feel passionately about the importance of languages, and yeah, that's why I made that change.
Yeah,
very glad I did.
Yeah,
hard work, but worth it.
No, and laudable stuff. Very, very important. So from once you were functioning as a full-time teacher, did you always know you were going to become a writer? Was that something you always had inside you? Was it something that just presented itself to you? What was the sequence of events that led to Death of a Clone?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I'd written quite a few short stories that have been published in various sci-fi and horror magazines over the years, but I'd never really taken that step up to writing a full-length novel. And yeah, I think it was during that period of kind of transitioning into becoming a teacher that I realised that was what I really wanted to do as well. And I mean, Death of a Clone was a sci-fi murder mystery, and again, it was something which I'd always had a real passion for golden age murder mysteries, but I'd also had a huge love for sci-fi and fantasy. So I wanted to put it into a setting that was rather than just a straightforward murder mystery. It was on an asteroid with clones. So yeah, it was something that had always been there, but I think during that transition to becoming a teacher, it just awoken that desire to do a bit more and write a full-length novel.
Yeah, brilliant. And the results are fantastic. Death of a Clone, for those who've not read it, is a kind of glorious genre mashup, as you were saying. One of the things it reminded me of, not in terms of its detail, but in terms of the job it was doing in terms of jamming two different things together. It's very much like Peter Hyams' Outland, which is essentially, High Noon in Space. I don't know if you've ever seen it, with Sean Connery. No. Yeah, so basically that was a film that was made in the 80s, and yeah, it's worth checking out. It's worth checking out. It's not a brilliant film. It's a decent film. Yeah, but it is absolutely High Noon set in space on a kind of space station or what have you. But I may have got the wrong person, but Alex, are you the same person who years ago wrote an article for Sci-Fi Now about mashups? That was you, right?
That was me, yeah.
And presumably you wrote that around, because I remember reading that. That's why your name rang a bell when I was talking to the guys at Angry Robot, and I assume the spur to that was the fact that you'd done exactly that with Death of a Clone. Yeah.
Absolutely right, yeah.
So for you, what are other examples of the genre mashing genre that you've enjoyed?
Any constraints?
No constraints whatsoever.
I mean, I'm a huge fan. I think one of my favourite authors of the last 20 years is David Mitchell. Almost because he just doesn't care about genre at all. He kind of says, I'm going to put my hand to anything and just shove it all together. And so things like, Bone Clocks and Ghostwritten, Cloud Atlas. I love the fact that he kind of sticks two fingers up to the idea that, oh, this must be a fantasy, or this must be sci-fi, this must be crime, and he just completely writes it his own genre, sui generis, and yet you read. I mean, have you read those?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Do you know how? I mean, you could pick up pretty much any page, any paragraph from his writing, and you just know it's him straight away.
Well, I completely agree.
Genre.
Yeah.
So that was for me, that those books, particularly Bone Clocks and Ghostwritten, I think are two great examples, not just of two genres, but of what you must try about 5 or 6 in there. And in terms of, I mean, things like Altered Carbon, which came onto Netflix recently, and the original book, of course, I think is a great example too of sci-fi and murder mystery being combined. In fact, there's been a bit of a glut of good combos recently of sci-fi and murder mysteries. What was the? I was on my shelf. I'll have to look up to it. You remember 6 Wakes by Mur Lafferty?
Oh yeah, Mur Lafferty's been on the show. Yeah, okay, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that. I thought that was
I agree with you, mate. I think that's a bit of a classic, actually, an instant classic, if you will.
Yeah, and just the idea was so original and so kind of really lovely to see. And there was one other which I read recently. Sorry, I'm just finding it on my shelf because I read it recently. The 16 Deaths. The 16 Deaths of. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
One with the 16 Deaths of something. I'm sorry, I can't.
It's funny. I'm fairly certain that I've spoken to the author of that book, and I'm also the Rusted Door of Memory is stopping me from presenting you with the title. But yeah, no, I absolutely, and this is again the less Rusted Door of Memory, but this is me reaching into reading your author. I've read, obviously, I've read so many, science fiction and literary articles during the course of my life. I couldn't even begin to say how many it was, but you're stuck with me because I correct me if I'm wrong, and I hope I'm not, transposing somebody else right onto you. But I think you, in that article, your sort of payoff was that great Alan Moore quote, which is about how we don't actually live in. And I'm not going to not going to approximate that quote off the top of my head, but it's a very well known quote and it's very funny. And have you got it to hand?
I might do. I remember the payoff line, but I don't want to spoil it.
But it's a great quote by the great Alan Moore, who
it ends up with saying it. Yeah, he says, life isn't. Where is it? Life is a mixture of Western and comedy and romance and tragedy and sci-fi thing. And then with a bit of pornography mixed in at the end.
Yeah, hopefully with some pornography mixed in, right? Yeah, and that says it all really, because of course we only classify things when it comes to entertainment in your real life, in the same way that very few lives have a beginning and a middle, and an end. Real life doesn't really work in narrative acts, right? They do in retrospect to a degree, but I think this is such a fascinating subject, and I think as to that, I think it's great that you've taken, the revolutionary novel form, the imprisonment form, but you've layered it sort of into the glorious world of science fiction, and I do think that people are going to respond very positively to Spidertouch, and I think your central concept, communication through touch, is such an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I hope so. Thank you. I think it's one of those things that there's that kind of old question of does language affect our personality, or is it the other way around? Is kind of is our culture cause the language? So when you think of things like German and the way those massive compound nouns, or the way Spanish people talk with those rat-a-tat sort of multi-syllable things, and it's really interesting as to which way around it comes. Is it kind of culture causing that language, or is it the language turning it into the personality? And so one of the things I was really interested in is, if you had a touch language, what kind of people would that create? Would rather than looking someone in the eye and sort of speaking, but actually being right up close, touching each other on your arms, what kind of culture would that be? What kind of relationships would you have with people? So that, I was really interested by that. And I guess similar to the way that blind people communicate, or the way that deaf people communicate, it's really an interesting area to look into.
I think it really is, and to layer it into your novel the way you have, in a very kind of surprising and thoughtful way, I think is a beautiful way to evaluate things and use those things to fuel your fiction and the drama of the story that you're telling. So I'm Andrew Sumner. This is the one and only Alex Thomson, and we have been talking about his new novel Spidertouch, which you can order from the links attached to this conversation. Thanks so much for dropping in, Alex. It's been really enjoyable speaking to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Really appreciate it.
Take care. All the best. Bye-bye. If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.